Good morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder. I'm the Executive Director of Executive Alliance, and I am delighted to have you all here today for Pulse Check, Maryland's Businesses, and DEIB. DEIB, or Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, is a concept that's been around since the 1960s. But of course, a stark spotlight on racial inequity, sparked by protests surrounding the death of George Floyd in May 2020, and highlighted continuously by the coronavirus pandemic, brought the DEIB movement to the forefront of the American workplace. 2 years later, it's time to see what's working and what isn't as companies strive to be more inclusive workplaces. So I'm delighted to welcome our panelists who are going to share their experiences with DEIB. Stephanie Baker, Janese Murray, and Neddy Perez. We are So introduce yourselves briefly, but I'm going to turn it over to Maria Darby first, who is the chair of Executive Alliance's mentoring committee. We're glad to have her. She is the chair of the Women's Heritage Commission and is an expert in developing people to have stronger connections in the workplace, and was a former COO at Keswick and the president or CEO of Darby Enterprises. So Maria, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to set the stage for really what we're seeing as companies integrate DEIB initiatives. We know that a lack of diversity at the upper levels of management can lead to unconscious bias. And in 2022, diversity in managerial and executive positions remains an issue for professionals of color. For instance, according to Zippia, 70.8% of managers in the US are white, while 14.4% are Latinx, 6.2% are Asian, and 6% are Black. At the executive level, Investopedia reports that the Fortune 500 has only 6 Black, 40 Asian American, and 20 Latinx CEOs. These stats prompt critical questions that are central to Executive Alliance and our mission to support the advancement of women, all women. It really calls into question whether there are enough diverse voices in the room when the initiatives are developed. And are DEIB initiatives being woven into the fabric or the very core of the company? And if so, how? And if not, what are your recommendations? So let's dive right in with our amazing panel as they introduce themselves. Stephanie, we'll start with you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Stephanie Baker. I am the chair-elect at Executive Alliance. I'm also the Chief Experience Officer at an organization called WAPA, and I lead our DEIB program there. Happy to join you this morning.
Great. Neddy?
Hi, I'm Neddy Perez. I'm the Vice President of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at McCormick. I've been in this space in particular for the last 28 years, working on human resources and diversity in the workplace. So happy to be here.
And last but not least, Janese Murray.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. I am Janese Murray. I lead a DEIB practice called Inclusion Impact Consulting, and previous to this have about 20 years of experience in the DEI world in a couple of corporations, the last one being Exelon Corporation. Good to be with you this morning.
So clearly we're going to have a great conversation this morning, and we're going to get right to it. So panelists, let's talk about what's happening with the DEIB initiatives at your companies or the companies you work with. How about, Neddy, why don't you start us off?
Thank you. I joined McCormick actually about 4 years ago, prior to George Floyd. But one of the things that we did was a real deep assessment of the organization and where our journey had been so far. Based off of that, one of the things that I saw was really critical was that we take a look at the journey and make sure that we reviewed our human resources practices to make sure that they were equitable. In doing so, what we ended up doing was looking at our policies or processes around hiring, advancement of talent, making sure that as we engage in external diversity partnerships that we look at making sure that there's a balanced approach in the relationships that we were forming. And so over the course of the last 4 years, one of the things that we've done is work to removing any organizational barriers that might exist in order to create a more equitable workplace environment. And so part of that included changing some of our policies or practices. Sometimes you can have policies and practices, right, that are kind of check the box, everything's okay. But when you start to really look at, are they working or are they not working? That's when the rubber meets the road, right? And so one of the things that we did was really listen to our employees, and we realized we needed to make tweaks to some of those practices to make sure we were advancing individuals at the right pace, that we were providing the same kinds of opportunities. So some of the things that we did were institute things like having diverse panels of individuals that would be part of the interview process. Making sure that we were going to external organizations like the Women's Food Forum or Women in Manufacturing. We also beefed up 2 programs, one focused on ethnically diverse talent in the US and one focused on women at the global level, to make sure that we were building the skill sets of these individuals so that they could navigate the corporate culture of the organization once they got in the door. And so these are a few of the things that we've been working on, but I'd love to hear from our other colleagues.
Great. How about you, Stephanie? You want to share?
Sure. So we started our DEIB program just before the George Floyd incident. And first, what we did was we understood that and recognized that the accountability starts at the top with our leadership team and our CEO. We surveyed our staff to get a pulse for how they felt we were doing as far as our culture and how it relates to diversity and inclusion. We then worked to create a DE&I roadmap. And then we added on the B afterwards. And so we wanted to ensure that there was inclusivity across all facets of the organization, looking at our talent acquisition roadmap, our compensation and benefits, as well as looking at our vendors. Are we making a conscious decision to maybe look at vendors that for companies that are women owned or minority owned? So that was important to us. And then most recently, we conducted an awareness training tied around looking at the disability spectrum and how diversity and inclusion plays a part there, and also the challenges around unconscious bias too. So it's an ongoing effort for us. And then externally, we created an equity and inclusion task force within the organization so that we can look for folks externally that we can partner with. So our company provides life insurance coverage to civilian federal employees. So we have partnered with an organization called BIGS. It's Blacks in Government, and they have a flag program for high school and college-bound kids who are interested in government positions. So we are working with them for our external efforts.
That's great. We're going to get into a little bit more of those questions in a minute. So Janese, how about you?
So I appreciate both Neddy and Stephanie's comments, because it really speaks to the importance of integrating this work into how you operate, run your business, and think of your strategies. Because one thing that I'm seeing in the firms, the organizations that I work with, are the employees, not the leaders, but the employees have an expectation around what they're going to see in the workplace. And if it feels the slightest bit performative, they're going to call it out. And so just putting a statement on the website and not doing anything else, this might be an overstatement a little bit, but there's kind of an activism behind it. And so, especially with younger employees, and I'm doing I'm actually doing a session about the importance of belonging in the workplace, especially as it relates to Gen Z, which are workers that are coming in. They expect there to be a diverse workforce. They are not fazed by racial racial differences or gender identity or any of that they've been living in that. They, a lot of them, the first president they knew was a Black president. And so all of the things that we kind of say, oh, this feels real different. They're like, well, no, this is actually how it is, and this is how it should be. And they're also very, very, very aware of things like intersectionality and recognizing the multiple identities that people bring into the workplace and expecting the organization to meet those multiple identities. And so, it becomes a retention issue as well as an engagement issue. And I always used to say in my corporate life, well, I know it's the right thing to do, but I want to make sure there's the business relevance. This generation is like, it's the right thing to do, should be good enough. And so the expectations are different than certainly when I came in the workforce and even the generation behind me. So it's something to keep in mind and making kind of those connections in addition to everything Stephanie and Neddy already said.
I think that's so true. I think let's going to talk a little bit about the partners and vendors, because that's a different level of intentionality, right, in terms of choices and how you're doing that work. So Neddy, let's talk a little bit about how you all are doing it at McCormick.
We have a full-blown supplier diversity program in place in terms of procurement, making sure that we're evaluating who are we working with and how. We have a number of corporate clients that we support that buy our products and services, and they have expectations and goals and metrics as well from a supplier diversity perspective. So many of our contracts and agreements, we have agreed upon goals, but also as a company, when we go out to market, we go ahead and we buy products and services from women, veteran, disability owned, and others, LGBTQ. As a matter of fact, my favorite story is about how when the building that is at 24 Schilling was being created, our head of supplier diversity actually worked with a local company to look at the furnishings. And it ended up being one of the largest contracts that we put in place with an LGBTQ vendor. And so when we're looking at our products, because we want to make sure they're sustainable, we look at our bottles, our red caps, our green caps, all of those things get outsourced for production. And so we look at who are the partners that we can bring in to do business. I did want to touch on something Janese said though, too, which is this piece, and I'm fascinated by it. It's around the social activism and the Gen Z population's commitment and passion for driving organizational change. And as many of you saw right after COVID, right after George Floyd, there was this intensity of passion that has increased around certain behaviors are no longer acceptable in the workplace. And so we had already, as a company, launched a social issues committee to look at what were the trends and challenges on a global level that we needed to be ahead of the game on in order to be able to listen to our employees and be able to respond to them. So when Roe versus Wade happened, we already had investors that were also active asking us about what is your position as a company, but our employees were also asking us. Our employees, when the Afghanistan situation occurred with the Taliban moving in, many of our military veteran employees came to us and asked us, what is the company's position? What are we going to do? How can we help people? When Ukraine and Russia happened, many of our employees also came forward and asked us, what is your position as a company? What are you going to do? So we are seeing those trends, and it's really important more than ever, even if you're a Maryland-based company, that you be aware of what are the social trends that are potentially going to impact your community in order to be able to take a stand, or even if it's to say, we're not ready to go there yet, but to have those conversations with your employees so that they feel that you as an organization, as an employer, are able to take a position organizationally about what's happening and relevant to them in the community. So I love the fact, Janese, you brought that up.
I think it's so true. I think that's really the interesting piece that workplaces are facing now, right? So it's not just, should we do it? Is it good for business? Yes, we should. Sort of the moral piece, but the other piece is that this is just a basic expectation of those coming into the workplace, that we will act accordingly to appropriate values, regardless of whether it's good for business. Sometimes, and when it isn't necessarily the cheapest or the best or easiest method to do that. So how are sort of companies reacting to that? Is it, because, things tend to have a long time to be able to go from like an idea to the company statement. So how are companies sort of adjusting to the fact that we have to now deal with, and appropriately, all of the issues that surround our workplace and our people that are that are working with us, and in the way that they're facing the world and the issues that are important to them? So who wants to take a stab at sort of sharing what they think's going on with that?
I'll take a stab at that, Maria. I think communication is really key. As Neddy mentioned, if an organization is not going to or is not ready to make a statement, we still need to have that dialogue with the employees. We need to be able to create a safe space where they can speak about their concerns, and then we need to be able to share the reasons why we aren't ready to make that statement, or other ways in which we will address it without making a formal announcement. So I think communication is key.
Yeah, I
ahead,
agree.
Janese.
I think the transparency, it's one part of the message is, yes, we think these things are important too. And we're not just saying, well, that's happening over there, and we're just going to kind of stick to our knitting, so to speak, which is such a baby boomer thing to say. But anyway, I just have caught myself there. But, knowing that, okay, this is something that we're also thinking about, and no, we're not ready yet. And, when will we, and just kind of holding to that. But I think the transparency, the lack of communication, and people, kind of make things up. So being very transparent about that, and, asking, well, what do you think? Bringing those voices in to hear the different perspectives, so that you can also get that employee input as well. But ignoring it.
Exploring it, right.
Ignoring it is at your own peril. It's just,
Yes.
You can't ignore it. Yeah.
That's true. I think the call for the discussion, regardless of whether the company, quote unquote, higher ups have all the answers, that's not really the point anymore, right? The conversation needs to happen amongst and with the people that might have more information than whoever's in charge of the communications chain at the company. And how do we do that in a transparent way that is more than just putting something on the website that says, we don't discriminate, or we're all inclusive, because we can, everyone can see through that. And if your actions aren't following up your words, right, then the balance, then it's really obvious. And then employees are not willing to tolerate that anymore, because they see this identity as a wraparound support for them. They're not a work person and then a home person, the way it was when I grew up. There was your work self, and then there was your other self. And so now the call is really for us to all be who we are, and to enjoy that diversity that brings to the workplace. But of course, it brings about challenges in a workplace too, right? And bumps and things we learn from, and how do we go from here? So kind of, where are some of the bumps, without just sharing the whole world of your dirty laundry, but like, where are the bumps that you're seeing as the workplace really struggles to sort of figure out where's the right tone, what's the right comment, where's the right line to be drawn? So who wants to start us off there?
Happy to jump in. I think going back to what Janese said about, we've got to be able to listen organizationally. So I think these assessments that organizations do, we just did a diversity, equity, and inclusion survey for the first time last year, last year. We've been activating and working on the things that our employees brought forward as concerns, to try and make sure we're addressing them, so that they know we're listening and we're taking action, right? That's going to be important. It goes back to, you may listen, but if they don't visibly see you taking action to address the issues and concerns, they're going to stop talking to you. So that's where disengagement starts to happen, right? The other thing that we have to be very mindful of is, in today's marketplace, whether it's in the US or outside the US, individuals have realized that the power that they personally have over their lives is better and stronger than ever, in that in today's marketplace, there is a shortage of talent, and particularly manufacturing space, but also other industries. And so if somebody feels disengaged or not valued at an organization, they can walk away. And Gen Z and even Gen Xers are more likely to walk away not having a job whatsoever, because they figure, hey, if I can't find a full-time job, I'm going to go be an Uber driver. I'm going to go work on Fiverr, put myself out there, put my skills out for hire. I've got all these other possibilities and websites that I can join that will give me side hustles that maybe I can convert into a full-time job. And so from that perspective, the value proposition that an employer was bringing to the table of, if you work 8 to 5 or 8 to 7, you get a paycheck and you get benefits, is no longer really relevant. Because if I'm not content with the job, or I feel that I'm not being listened to, or I'm not a valued team member, I can go somewhere else, make more, and or I can create my own side hustle that I can turn into a full-time gig and be able to survive. And so I think because you've got the digital economy kicking in, there are a lot more opportunities. So as an employer, if you're not listening to what's important and relevant and addressing those concerns, which include, from a diversity perspective, do I have the opportunities to advance? Do I have the same opportunity as my colleague a couple of desks away to be able to get promoted or to work on new assignments or to travel internationally, et cetera? Then I can make the choice of going to find a new employer or going to find a new side hustle that I can turn into a full-time job. So.
And if I could add to, employees want to see other people within the organization that resemble themselves. Right. And so they're looking at that when they're coming in to interview. They're looking at the interview panelists that are in front of them. They're looking at their peers sitting in the next seat from them. And I think one of the challenges now that companies are facing is, years ago, when we thought of diversity, we think of race, we think of gender, and we think of physical ability. Right. So now you add on more things to that, right? You add on gender identity and gender expression. So those are two different new things that you have to focus on now. And the millennials, or the Gen Zs, if you will, they're looking at that. And half of the time they're educating us.
Well, that's that whole intersectionality that was brought up earlier, is we are realizing in the DEI space and DEIB space that we're not just one thing. We don't just identify as women. There are women that are LGBTQ. There are women that are Hispanic LGBTQ, women that are Asian who have disabilities. And so this whole intersectionality really begins to open us up to different types of dialogue that in the past employers really didn't have to be as astute about in terms of how they responded and how they thought about the work environment. Flexibility in the workplace is the number one thing that people are seeking. They would rather have more flexibility than even a higher paycheck in some cases. Now, both would be great, right? But people are really seeking more that flexibility in the work environment.
The thing that I would add to that, I think, are expectations around how leaders show up. And so, you know, just focusing on doing a series of tasks, as opposed to leading others and leading with vulnerability and empathy and all these things we've been taught not to do. That is really important to how people feel a sense of connection and belonging. And this belonging thing is not some squishy woo-woo. This is about people saying, I will stay longer because I have that sense of belonging. I will give. There's a study that I was just looking at by an organization, COQUAL. They used to be the Center for Talent Innovation. And what they looked at are the high sense of belonging when people have a high sense of belonging, what are they experiencing? And with organizations, they're seeing leaders that look like them, that model certain behaviors. And the thing that really struck me was that the rules apply to everyone. So if there's a leadership, if there's a sexual harassment, for, just as an example, that a senior leader does, and that person is still there and nothing happens, and it's not the same for the desk level employee, then people feel that sense of inequity. It's almost like an injustice, going back to that social activism. And so,
Yes.
Things that of leaders really showing up differently, that's one of the things that that I see as a challenge. It's moving DEIB out of what others need to do to what I need to do. And to me, that's always the challenge. It's good when it's like, okay, you all, do da 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 da, but now I got to change what I'm doing. I don't know how I feel about that. And so, real quick example, and then I don't want to take up too much time, but a friend of mine is hiring somebody and she's having trouble, to your point, Neddy, about the shortage of talent. And so she's interviewing this person, and the only question the person asked was about work-life balance. And so she comes out of that with, that person has gone down a peg in her mind because all they asked about was work-life balance. I said, so do you know what this person even meant by that? Being curious, like, when you say that, what do you mean? And second of all, you can dismiss her, but there's 20 others coming in right behind her who want the same thing. And so how do you make that adjustment to say, okay, all right, I'm struggling with this. I need to get better at this, but let me at least find out what this person is asking for before I lay all of my assumptions on what work-life balance means.
And it's different for each individual. It could be different.
True.
Right.
And I think that that's the piece that's interesting, is that, companies sort of have been moving from this place where there's a DEIB checklist, right, of things that they should be doing, which probably we should have been doing long before this became an issue, but okay, we're making some progress, right? But it's also about saying, it's about changes in behavior, personal behavior as a leader, what the expectations are to be able to say, it's not just an office that has DEIB in it and they're doing some activities and some things and everyone's coming together. And it's really about saying, how do I reflect that as a leader? How am I projecting the discussion of vulnerability, but also that I don't know, right? Because I may not be as familiar with all of the sort of issues that are at play. And then how do I say and feel confident and to be able to make space for the conversation of what we don't know, recognizing that only by talking about what we don't know will we learn more, right? How do we do that? And I think that that's a piece that companies are really struggling with in some ways, because it's about exposing maybe their own inadequacies as the leadership, whatever level they're in the organization, and being able to say, maybe someone younger to the workplace, someone newer to our organization has more knowledge than I possess. And how do you take that, and how do you create space for that, and really celebrate that as a company as a strength and not as a weakness? And I think that when people are hiring now, that's happening. You're right, Janese, right at the interview table. Like it's very interesting that people aren't sort of waiting till they get the job to then ask the hard questions that they want to know about life balance or what the other flexibility from home. It's really about having those, really being clear about their own expectations up front and really creating that shift in power. And so how does that's really broadened then the conversation of DEIB in a lot of ways in the last couple of years from those who were doing this work, even long before George Floyd. So how have you seen that work expand, and what does that look like? And how are you sort of touching base with your team members to see if you're tracking? Who wants to start us off?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think this is where, again, doing the spot checks with managers and leaders, having specific goals around what is part of their development. So I think it was mentioned earlier about providing ongoing training and coaching to individuals. We're getting ready to roll out disability awareness training to make sure that our managers understand and our employees understand what are the do's and don'ts of interacting with someone with a disability. And let's face it, even the disability space itself has changed a lot from talking about visible disabilities to talking about mental health disabilities and non-visible disabilities in the work environment. What does that mean? What can you say or do when you're trying to be helpful, but you don't know exactly what to do, right? So that ongoing training is really critical. I think too, it's important to have some clear-cut measures of what's expected of individuals in the work environment, not just having the employee value proposition, not just saying we stand for XYZ values, but rather it's about how are you measuring that? And then when you're looking at that, are you looking at things like the turnover rate of that manager or leader's department? Are you looking at absenteeism or safety issues? Sometimes safety issues can be grounded in the fact that people are getting into accidents because they're really stressed out. And I remember years ago working for a senior leader actually in the diversity space of all things. And some of us were comparing notes, and there were a number of people had migraine headaches, lower back issues. One person shared that they were having heart palpitations. And at the end of the day, what we concluded was it was the leader who was causing all of this because there was a lot of stress. We were in the middle of resolving a class action lawsuit, which didn't help any, right? We were working towards all of these things and they were compounding, but also the leader played a significant role in how the employees within the department were responding because we were all so stressed out. And so we had to have some, formal conversations, but safety is a critical part and measure of diversity issues. Aside from the safety, how many people are leaving? What's your turnover rate? Who's getting promoted? Who isn't? If you see a high propensity of Caucasian females, but nobody else, that's not really truly diversity. The question is, how many other individuals, male, female, ethnically diverse talent are being promoted in the organization? What are the skills? What are they going to? So those are all questions that need to be asked of a leader. Sometimes just performance and delivery of a product or production of a particular department isn't enough. You have to look at other factors to see, is that person truly a holistic leader, or are they just, to what was said earlier, checking the box, meeting the bottom line, but nothing else? Because there are hidden costs when turnover happens. And so if you don't understand that, that can actually be more expensive than producing XYZ widget.
That's true.
And Maria, if I could add, in addition to the disability training, we have done that as well recently. We also trained around how to become a better ally, right? And also the bystander intervention. That's critically important when you're focused on DEI and B. You want to make sure that if there's situations that come up, that there's another person that's feels comfortable enough to step in and say, hey, this is an uncomfortable situation, or that wasn't right what you just said. So training around bystander intervention is really critical.
And I think the only thing that I would add that I'm kind of seeing is, and I work with the organizations that are still trying to figure this out. So, what I'm seeing is the recognition that this cannot just be an events-based activities type of, approach. Not that that goes away, but that there has to be more done intentionally around looking at practices, policies, and things like that, that I'm sure Neddy and Stephanie have already done as part of their organizations. But when you're a lot of the, not all, but a number of these organizations really stepped up their efforts after the murder of George Floyd. Well, that's only been 2 years. Mm-hmm. And so just kind of working through okay, it still isn't enough. It still isn't enough. We've got to do more. We've got to do more. And moving my work from workshops and things like that to, how do we think about this truly from a holistic strategic perspective and not just, again, events activities, because it's good for engaging employees and getting the message out that you care, but it doesn't the change may not be as significant as when you start looking at what the organizational practices and processes are.
The only other thing I'd add to, if I can, is it's what you reward, what behavior you
Yeah.
accept. And so if
Yeah.
you have somebody who is courageous that says, hey, this is happening to me, or this is happening to a colleague, what does the organization do? Does it fully investigate? Does it then also thank the person that stepped forward and say, thank you for having the courage to speak up, and reward that person by acknowledging what they've done? But does the company then, or the organization, take action to rectify the decision that was made around the individual that was investigated or the issue that was uncovered? Do they make the change? If they don't, there are a lot more people, and the grapevine nowadays is so hot that word will spread. And so if you spend millions of dollars in advertising or hundreds of thousands of dollars advertising, talking about how great your company is, the amount of energy and time that it would take to undo a situation where someone has come forward and said, this is happening to me and nothing was done about it, will be double, if not triple the amount, because then you lose your reputation, you lose the credibility of who your company is, and employees will become less trusting and more likely to jump ship, because do they want to stay in an organization that isn't going to protect them and provide a safe environment? So it's equally important. What does the company do after they're made aware of what's happened or of a situation?
And that caused me to think of something that we haven't really touched on, and it's the role of the HR department. Because my HR training from hundreds of years ago was when there's an action taken, you don't say anything about it. And so, privacy, confidentiality, all of that, and navigating that with, okay, this happened, everybody knows this happened, and what's been addressed, especially if the person is still walking around the company. So it's kind of it's this tightrope of, how much do we say to let people know we took it seriously, and still, where there might be some legal exposure if we say or do too much. That is, I think, something that it's case by case, but I see that, also as a challenge.
Stephanie, what do you think about that? I'm sure it's a world that you're experiencing given your role in the company.
Yeah, I agree. It's a challenge. It's a delicate balance on what do you say and what you don't say, because the staff is watching, right? Especially if they know about the situation, they're watching and waiting to see if there's some action that's going to be taken. I think it's a little easier with a smaller organization than it is with a larger organization, but again, it's all the same issue.
I think that's true, because that's really the difference. And part of what we were just talking about is the difference between saying you have a DEIB initiative and embedding the DEIB initiative into the fabric of the company, right? Where people are sort of recognizing that not everyone grew up in that environment, and how are they able to learn themselves and make mistakes, because people will make mistakes. It's a relationship-based issue, right? And so how do they do that and feel comfortable enough to be able to say, I made a mistake, versus the whole other level, right? Because there's a mistake that how you take a mistake might not be just a mistake, right? There's a whole realm of that. And how do you sort of manage that, both that individual issue, but then how does that play out for other employees that might be experiencing situations alike or different than that, but also kind of as part of the company, what they're saying versus what they're doing? Right. So sort of what are you all, companies that are beginning this effort, or sort of maybe hit some hurdles along the way, or, sort of frustrated because they feel like they're doing the work, but yet the employees don't seem to get it, right? Like they don't seem to recognize the efforts we're making. What advice would you give with them? What do you say, would you share with someone who's been trying to make an effort, but really might be hitting some hurdles internally?
The one thing that
Go ahead, Stephanie.
The one thing that I would say is that it's important to continuously solicit feedback from staff. That's so important. That helps shape the initiatives that you're going to create moving forward. It makes the staff feel like they're being heard, right? And then you also have to look at your organizational culture. How does DEIB, how does it complement your culture? How is it embedded into your culture? And if it isn't, then you need to take a step back and ask yourself, what do you want your organizational culture to be? And it may look completely different today than how it looked years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also, one thing that some companies don't do well is they communicate and hear from the employees. And when they actually take action, they don't tie it back and come back and say, we heard you say X, Y, Z, and here's what we did. And here's what we didn't do, and here's why. But we took it and we did. So just kind of this is a place where over communication is not a bad thing. And expecting that people are going to have varying levels of connection with this, but also that, as much as you can draw back to what you have done and connect those dots, as opposed to just assuming people are going to see the actions and they're going to make the connections for themselves.
I would completely agree with what both of you have said. I think there is a piece here of being able to do some storytelling of, this is what happened in one scenario. You certainly can avoid using names, but people may be familiar with the bigger scenarios. And there's certainly a lot of stories in the newspaper about things that have happened and have gone awry. And so drawing from those and saying, look, we're trying to avoid this kind of situation in the future. This is why we're taking these actions and why we need your commitment to be courageous, to speak up. And then I think what you'll find is, particularly in today's world, people aren't just, listening to what's being said, they're watching to the behaviors and actions that are being taken. I remember myself, my grandfather always used to say, you can listen to anything anybody tells you, but if there isn't congruency between what they say and what they actually do, then there's not truth in the middle. So stay away. And so I always, when I talk to leaders, I tell them, what you say is as important as the actions you take. If someone brings something to you and you know about it and you don't take action, you're as culpable, but also that is going to be seen by others. And that's going to put people, if there's a significant issue in the organization, it's going to drive those conversations further underground. And then you might find yourself being hit with a lawsuit, which is what people really ultimately in the corporate space want to avoid, right? So, and I've had the opportunity to work with a number of companies that have had to deal with class actions. Some of my jobs have been a result of somebody wasn't doing what they were supposed to, and I was brought in to try and turn things around. And those are not fun times, because then you've got to do a lot more awareness building, a lot more skills building, a lot more proving that the organization really is trying to change its ways. And that takes a lot more externally and internally. But being truthful and showing and sharing the information that you can that says, hey, we're not perfect, because no company is. I've worked for 7 companies, and I've yet to find the perfect ideal company where there is no single leader that has done something wrong, right?
Then you wouldn't be there. You wouldn't be there.
I wouldn't be there. I wouldn't have a job. I'd be doing something else. I'd be skydiving or something. I don't know. But at the end of the day, admitting that we're not a perfect organization, we have our faults. We're trying to work through them. And here are the things we're trying to do, and sharing that and being transparent. And I think that's what a lot of employees are looking for, is that level of transparency of conversation. to say, okay, well, at least they're trying to fix what's not working. And then I'm willing to hang out with them for a while longer because they're working towards something.
I think you're right, because the conversations, I think you said they'll go underground, but part of us, we all know, those of us who've been in the workplace a long time, that these conversations have always happened. People always know more than whoever's in charge think they know. They know much more about the specifics, frankly, often than the people who are in charge of the situation. And so it's really about saying you're giving a voice to the challenges your company is facing that ultimately is a growth opportunity for the company if you choose to see it that way. Because in the past, those things happened and people just left, or they sued you, or they did all of those things, and because that was like, it had been going on underground for plenty of time and no action was taken. Well, now that there's an opportunity for these discussions, it also allows for there to be more transparency on each side of that equation to say, this is how you can do better. This is the situation. And I think that employees are often more tolerant then of the bumps along the way, right? They're more willing to say, yeah, that didn't hit the mark. And they tell you, as opposed to sort of walking away from the situation entirely. And I think that's really where the growth happens, both for individuals and for the company, that ultimately nets out for the bottom line. I mean, in the bigger picture, personnel for almost every company is its biggest expense, and turnover in that anytime, but particularly during the pandemic and since then, as you know, it's incredible how difficult it is to find employees, but also the ones that will want to stay with you because you're giving them the right mix of life, work, all the things they're coming to the workplace for. So I think it's it's hard work, right? There's nothing easy about this piece, but in some ways, one might say that I'm going to call these what historically been called the soft skills, have become, interestingly enough, what's driving companies now, what's driving workforces, what's driving conversations. And some might say that inherently women that have been criticized for some of those soft skills might have opportunities if they're in the room, if they're being engaged, if they're in discussion, if they're in leadership and they're in roles that allow them to converse about this, actually create pathways for stronger representation in leadership positions at higher levels of organizations from a more diverse audience. So what are you all seeing in that? Are you seeing that it's making sort of a real difference in how diversity of people can find a pathway to the top, whatever the top looks like for them? Are you still seeing, because the numbers that we talked about in the beginning sort of unfortunately show that we have a long way to go. So kind of where are you all feeling that we are as a community of corporations in Maryland and in this country?
So Maria, I do agree. We still have a long way to go, right? But I think it's important for corporations to recognize that and look at the talent pool that they have, create those opportunities for not just women, create the opportunities for those that aren't already sitting at the table. Because when you have a diverse group of voices and thinkers, that helps to create a sound strategic plan. It helps with your bottom line, as you mentioned. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think making the commitment to do so is important.
Completely agree with Stephanie's comment. I think that there are certainly other ways that you can engage employees in conversations so that their voices are heard. I do think that some of the skills that traditionally women have brought to the table have and will provide them with the opportunity to advance a little bit more quickly, only because we're now 51% plus of the workforce, right? So just by the sheer numbers, there'll be more opportunities. But I think for a company that's really committed to this work, that they owe it to themselves, they owe it to their employees to be able to find ways to engage other voices, because that will make them that much stronger, whether it be through employee ambassador groups or what are sometimes called employee resource groups, having those groups be part of product design or part of being in the room and having the conversation around a market strategy, or even when it comes to rethinking how do we approach our talent management process or our talent acquisition process. I know during COVID at McCormick, our HR organization was busy creating, policies and processes to be able to address, COVID in the work environment. And one of our employee groups, no pun intended, called SAGE, which were our older employees, they raised their hand and they said, wait a second, we've got a lot of employees that are parents who are caregivers. We have also employees who are caregivers to their parents. And so what are we doing? How do we create flexibility in the work environment so that they feel that they have the flexibility to be able to do their job, but also care for their parent or their child? And so thank goodness for them raising their voice, because we took that into consideration in our COVID strategies in creating space. So leveraging your employees to be sounding boards. When Asian hate crimes hit in the Baltimore area, our Asian employee groups came forward. Same thing with our Black employees after George Floyd situation. Thanks to them, we were able to bring them together and hear their voices about what needed to be different in our policies or processes as an organization to create space for greater conversations. So finding other ways to engage your employees in the discussion and the policy development and design, and in your other strategies from an HR perspective, can be very valuable in creating a more holistic organization.
And, just to add to that, I think one of the things, especially as we think of senior, people moving into senior level roles and ultimately getting to the C-suite, is about sponsorship. And, having especially white men sponsor those outside of their own group. And I remember we were, and I'm not always a huge fan of sponsorship programs, because then it's like, forced, as opposed to what does it mean to be a sponsor? And if you look at the people that you truly speak up for in meetings, do they all look like you? And if they do, it's going to be much more difficult for others to be, part of the conversation, because until we get in the room, we're not in the room. And I was talking to a white male leader who I had a really great relationship with, which is why I could say this, and we were talking about sponsorship, and he said, I never had a sponsorship program. Meanwhile, his father worked at the company. His father was an executive, and he helped him get the job there. So I'm like, okay, so let's talk about your career path. That is a lived sponsored program. My father would never have gotten a job at that company at that level. And so it's taking it out of the mindset of there's something wrong with me, that I need something different, and putting in it, there are systems in place that have advantaged others and disadvantaged some. So how do we, that's the equity piece, how do we bring that in and be intentional about leaders being challenged? Like, everybody I see you with looks like you. What else is going on? What might you be missing by not reaching out to a broader group of employees? And that looked like you could be anything from race, gender, whatever. That sponsorship piece really makes the difference in whether or not women, especially, BIPOC women definitely, are going to make it to the C-suite. And we tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored. And so making that shift and recognizing the difference is really, really important. To have a program. It could be some very, very well-placed questions that are asked around talent management about who are we paying attention to and who are we leaving on the margins.
Thank you very much, ladies. We're going to move into see if there's any questions. Rebecca, there any questions from our guests today?
There are a few questions, and while people are formulating their questions, I did want to, I had neglected to share thanks to our sponsors. And so I wanted to quick do that. Our sponsors really make it all possible. And so our sustaining partner is Whiting Turner. Our advocate partners are USI and Wells Fargo. Mentor partners include the Baltimore Business Journal, the Afro, the Daily Record, PNC, and Caring Transitions Baltimore Metro. We're excited to have McCormick as a mission partner, as well as Gordon Feinblatt and Sandy Spring Bank. Our support partners are Pink Dog Digital, I-95 Business, and Strategic Factory. And our member partners are Ellen and Tucker, the Greater Baltimore Business Bureau, Girls on the Run, Inline LLC, and National Kidney Foundation, serving Maryland and Delaware. So thank you to all of our partners. I'm also going to make a little plug, because this is the kickoff session for a series of DEIB briefings throughout the year. Our next session is for Executive Alliance members only. And if you're interested in membership, our website is executivealliance.org. Just go to the join. We are focused on senior executive leaders, and we'll focus on having courageous conversations when good intentions go awry. And Karen Bond, who is an Executive Alliance member and a fabulous DEIB professional, is going to lead that for us. And then we'll come back to a public Zooms forum in January with a discussion on intersectionality. Janese had mentioned that early on, and I think that's a critical part. So that'll be a discussion and workshop through Zoom entitled "We Are All Women and." And in the meantime, I hope to see all of you at our Women of Excellence event, which is next Tuesday at Martin's West from 4 to 7. Our keynote will be Jackie Insinger, who has developed a book called Spark Brilliance on the Science of Positivity and how that can spark brilliance in you and your teams. All right, I feel like I have chatted enough to give everybody an opportunity to put their questions in. One of the questions that we had earlier dealt with surveying. Each of you had talked a little bit about the importance of checking in with staff and what they think. Do you have suggestions about what kinds of questions to ask and what you need to be looking for to build trust in those surveys?
I can jump in. So we did a full-blown diversity, equity, and inclusion survey that included more than about 20-something questions. But you can also do shorter surveys. So I think the trend right now is about 7 to 10 questions. The types of questions are, do you feel trusted by your manager? Do you feel that you are respected in your work with your work team or with your work in your work environment? And then the other pieces have to do with, do you feel that you can share your ideas and that they will be moved forward? So questions along those lines that kind of give you an idea of, is the person or individual responding to it feeling valued? We do tend to tell people, one, we won't report out, your specific responses, but we will look at managers who have 10 or more reports, and they will get an aggregate report about the responses. We are planning in the future to use those survey results to look at managers and their teams in terms of, is this an individual that has a high level of engagement in the organization with their team around respect and treating individuals with dignity? If not, then there will be eventually goals and objectives for those individuals. And then the other piece, I would say it's really important when you're trying to build trust of letting your employees know that the survey is anonymous, and repeating that as often as possible. A lot of employees over the years, some of who have had bad experiences, are kind of uncomfortable responding to your surveys. So you really do need to go out of your way to show how you're keeping the survey responses anonymous. One way that we do it is by letting employees know that we're not going to share any information for any groups that are below 10, because at that point, people start to kind of guess what so-and-so said. So those are just a few things that we do.
And if I could add, we incorporated questions around what employees felt were promotional opportunities, or if they felt there are promotional opportunities from what they can tell, because that's important too. If you get responses that indicates that no one feels that there's promotional opportunities, then you know that there's work that needs to be done.
Good idea.
And another one around intent to leave, again, being able to break that down by, if everybody intends to leave, that's one problem. If only a certain group intends to leave, that's a whole different problem.
Mhm. Oh, those are good suggestions. Okay, from Jordan, we have, what are a few things you suggest for a DEI committee to do or work on? So another set of mechanical question.
I would say if a company currently does not have a DEI and B policy, that is something that you can start to work on first by creating what is your mission statement, and then determining what those commitments are to that mission statement. Then also looking at different initiatives that can be looked at internally and externally. So I mentioned earlier that we created a task force for equity and inclusion, our external focus. So that's a way to get staff members involved too.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there is look at your policies and processes and leverage the Equity and Inclusion Committee to do a review of those. You can divide it up among individuals and then bring them back together and have a discussion. And a lot of these policies, processes need to be reviewed at least once a year, if not, every 2 years max, just because they become outdated. A few years ago, we weren't talking about gender orientation or equal employment opportunity policy. Now, gender orientation has to be in there. Otherwise, how do you, make sure that you're being inclusive of that particular population, right?
True.
And the only thing that I would add is, what is the role and the position of the committee in relationship to the leadership of the organization? So, is there an expectation that this group will serve in some sort of an advisory capacity, so that all this work that, Stephanie and Neddy have talked about actually sees the light of day and is adopted and visibly supported and championed by the leaders. So they're not just kind of, operating in a vacuum.
That's a great point. That's really important. Because I think sometimes people feel like that these committees are doing this work, but the leadership, mostly the most senior leadership, might have not necessarily any daily interaction with what that looks like. So it's a great point.
Yeah.
Anything else, Rebecca, before we wrap up?
Yes, it looks, we have a couple questions, but so Caitlin's asking the connection between social activism and DEIB, and asking if you can expand on the role, if any, that corporate social responsibility and partnership with community nonprofits working on equity issues plays in your DEIB strategy. It feels like it's getting into that vendor partner space. So if you all could address that, that would be terrific.
I'm happy to address it. So when we created our social issues committee, we actually pulled together an internal team made up of our public affairs officer, our chief corporate global communications officer, our investor relations officer, and then also our organizational change management leader, and our chief legal counsel. This particular, and myself. And so myself and the chief corporate communications officer chair the committee, so that there might be issues that she is privy to or issues that I might see, but anyone on the committee can bring these together so that we have a global lens on what's happening at any given time. When we bring the committee together, we talk about what the company's position should be, what our scan of the environment has been, and if there are some external organizations. So for instance, with regards to the Marriage Equality Act, we were partnering with Out and Equal and the Human Rights Campaign to get advice and counsel on what other companies were doing. When Asian hate crimes occurred, we partnered with Ascend, a nonprofit professional association for Asian business professionals, to get their input and their guidance. And they were creating a position paper that they were asking companies to sign on. So we looked into it, we addressed what they were asking of us, and we also looked at what was happening within our employee ambassador group and what their concerns were. So we're taking a holistic approach of employee engagement, external partnerships, and then what's happening in the landscape externally, so that we could then come up with a recommendation for our CEO and the executive leadership team and our CHRO. Once we did that, we reviewed it with them. They then reviewed it. If it required us taking it to the board of directors, then our CEO and our head of HR or the chief communications officer or myself would put together a white paper that would then go directly to the board for review. Or sometimes it was a paragraph or a letter that we wanted to make sure they had a chance to review before we went public. But that way, that type of committee allowed us to make sure we engaged all of the different critical voices within the company that were decision makers, so that we could present a good opportunity for discussion to the executive team before we went public.
Great, thank you. All right, so it feels like we're coming to the end of our time together this morning. Thank you, Janese Murray, Stephanie Baker, and Neddy Perez for sharing with us your perspectives and a little look into what DEIB is happening here in Maryland, a little pulse check. And I do hope that we continue this conversation both together with Executive Alliance and in the larger community. I'm going to turn it to you, Rebecca, as we sign out.
Terrific. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I think it was a substantive and fabulous discussion. I learned a lot, and I feel like we all have some actionable ways to move us forward as we navigate to more inclusive environments that that benefit us all. So, are there any closing statements that you'd like to make from Stephanie, Neddy, or Janese?
Thank you for having us.
Great.
Yes, it was, thanks for putting this on. It's important work.
Well, thank you all so much. And to our participants as well, we did record this session. We will have it up on the Executive Alliance YouTube, and hopefully we will see you all in January for our next public Zoom on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.